Institute. My pleasure to welcome you all today, those of you here in the room and those of you on our live webcast, to Merger of the Century, Why Canada and America Should Become One Country, by the author Diane Francis, a fascinating financial journalist, splits her time between New York and Toronto, and I've read her for years and years and years, and it's been a pleasure in the last couple months to really get to know her a little bit, at least know what she looks like in person. So with that, Diane's going to talk about the book for a while, and then we'll get into a panel. We have some comments on the book and her ideas and what it means for the larger continent, the larger economy. So you didn't come here to hear me, so I'll turn it over to Diane.
Okay, thank you all for finding this place. Of course, if you live here, it's not as difficult as it was for me. I'm glad I gave myself extra time. Straight into it. They wanted me to talk for about 20 minutes. I'll try and hold myself to that, although I could talk forever about this book. I really enjoyed writing this book. I really love my idea of merging the two countries, if I must say so myself. And you don't spend 4 years and do all this research unless it's something that you really enjoy. And so I will explain to you, but I'll kick it off with a wonderful quote that I came across in my research by a novelist who won the Giller Prize out of Alberta, Will Ferguson. He's a novelist and he's a humorist, and he spent about 20 years in Asia and came back to Canada and came up with this and wrote a very humorous book about Canada. But one of the lines that I thought resonates and still does is he said that the great themes of Canadian history have been about keeping the Americans out, the French in, and hoping the natives somehow disappear. Acerbic, but I think dead on. And I'm not saying that Canadians internalized these themes, but certainly the political forces in Canada, the so-called Laurentian consensus that's run the country, certainly ever since I've lived there in Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto, to the exclusion of a lot of other folks in the country, have always had that belief. And they have sculpted policies and attitudes in that same way, shape, and form, also inheriting that mentality from the British. And let's not forget that the British, that the US-Canada border is essentially the line that the British were able to hold through guile and cunning to keep the Americans out without an occupying force. And so that's what they did. They signed treaties with Indian bands, they made deals with the French, they brought in mercenaries, and they colonized the place with revolutionary soldiers that consisted of United Empire loyalists, runaway slaves, German mercenaries, and British regular soldiers who got 160 acres when they demobilized anywhere in the world. So they colonized the place with British loyals and made their deal with the French. And of course, the deal with the French was don't join the Americans in their revolution. We will protect Catholicism. We will protect your right to a language. And in return, you will not fight for anybody. You don't have to fight for us either. And so that's been the sort of pact that the British set up, and we are still living with a lot of the threads and the legs as a result of that basic DNA of the country. Took me 4 years. Reaction has been interesting. It's gained traction in the United States as a foreign policy book. I got a lovely letter from Hillary Clinton, who liked the book very much. I got a nice note from Jeb Bush. I've been invited to the Perot's to present to their close friends in Dallas things about the book. And I'm speaking to a number of universities and around the country. In Canada, people are horrified. They're horrified. Again, that goes back to the strain of anti-Americanism that was part of the DNA in the formation of the country and in the governing of the country, and that still exists. And it's very offensive to me because being American is my ethnic group. And I was born in the United States. So those are the things. Now, just to give you the overarching reasons, the existential challenges, the 3 existential challenges that underpin the reason for writing this book, that this book tries to address. And my bias is declared right up front. I think I'm a merger. I'm American and Canadian. I think the two countries should just merge and get it over with. I think they're already merging. I think it's underway and inevitable. However, I went through a thought experiment to sort of debunk and just to get it out there so people could start to at least not discredit or say that it's impossible and just discount it out of hand. in either country. So I wanted to take on the Canadian establishment. I wanted to take on the fact that Americans know very little about Canada and should know a lot more because we are partners de facto. The three existential challenges, starting from the top, is what I call the new Cold War 2.0. The new Cold War is not military. It is state capitalism, models such as Russia Inc. and China Inc. and Arab Inc. and South Korea Inc. and Japan Inc. Versus free enterprise. And so we see this playing out. Most recently, of course, in the Crimea, that was completely predictable, and that's a different topic. But the Cold War is a very serious issue, and it is bearing down on Europe and on the United States and Canada. It is our multinationals going out trying to conquer markets and living standards against Chinese and Russian and other companies who have at their backs, covering their backs, their governments, either as owners or partners. They're subsidized. They enable them diplomatically. They do all kinds of things to protect them. They're protectionist. For instance, a Chinese company can buy an iconic Canadian oil company, which recently happened, or an iconic agribusiness in the United States, Smithfield's Food, which recently happened, and we cannot buy their iconic companies, even if we can afford to. So there is a lack of reciprocity. They have gone right nicely through the cracks in all of this. This is a constant theme in my writings. And so this is an existential challenge, and they're beating us. They're beating us to oil fields. They're beating us to ore bodies. Many examples in my first chapter called A Dangerous World about mining companies just being confiscated because the Chinese blew into town. They promised a veto on the Security Council to the dictator. They opened a Swiss bank account or whatever they did, and suddenly the mine is confiscated without any compensation. And so we have this kind of thing going on, as I say, around the world. And this is a major existential challenge. Obviously, if the United States and Canada merged as the Europeans have, bigger is better in the face of this. And also, it's very important to have a perimeter in mentality around the two countries so that penetration into one can't affect the other against their wishes and against their better interests. Canada has a number of existential challenges which have been outlined in this book and is also the underpinning for the book. First of all, Canada, with a population of 35 million people, which is relatively small, will not make the G20 cut in 10 years. And it is the second biggest piece of real estate, under which is huge buried treasure that it cannot develop financially and cannot defend militarily. I'm not talking about invasion, but you are talking about the fact that the resources have been targeted by Asian giants. The Russians have declared the Arctic as Russian. Canada really has no way of developing out, building the infrastructure necessary to develop the treasure trove in the Arctic. The Arctic is empty, virtually empty. By comparison, the Russians are well into development of Siberia, has a bigger population than Canada, has many cities larger than Chicago, has 25 seaports, rail, road, industry. Alaska has at least 20 times the number of the amount of economic activity, 3 times as many mines, an oil industry that's been developed. We could have had an oil industry in the Northwest Territories, and it has not been developed, and we still are waiting for a permit for a pipeline 30 years later to come down from the top of the country to markets in the south in terms of natural gas. Now there's an oil strike in the Northwest Territories, so we're going to see what happens with that. But basically you have this existential challenge with Canada. Who's going to develop its resources? And they will be developed. The planetary arithmetic dictates that. We can't keep it a park for polar bears, even if we wanted to. The other problem with Canada existentially is the brain drain. This has been a historical issue. This is Austria's problem. This is New Zealand's problem. This is always the problem of the little guy next to the big guy that has a much more dynamic economy and a pull factor that is impossible to stop. And so that is another constant problem for Canada on an ongoing basis. The U.S.-Canada border is another existential issue. The border is at 26 years after a two-way free trade agreement worse than it was before. Manufacturing is now starting to leave Canada. I talk to the business community. Since I've written this book, the speaking engagements that I've done with various sectors of the business community in Canada have leaped. Agriculture, oil, mining, logistics, agriculture, agriculture I already mentioned, they're all very upset about the fact that the border is worse than it's ever been and nothing seems to be happening. I have my second chapter on the binational irritants behind this border problem, but I would submit that the entry to our free trade two-way deal in '94 of Mexico has changed all the focus of the United States into the southern border issues and problems. And so if you say NAFTA to an American, you say border to an American, they think Mexico. They don't think about Canada. And so there is a problem in terms of Canada, and I have been arguing for 5 years or so that we should have an asymmetrical NAFTA, that we should proceed, Canada, the US, to integrate as quickly as makes sense for both countries or as both countries desire, whereas Mexico will be slower or it will stay the way it is. There's nothing wrong with that. This is kind of the way Europe developed. The southern European countries were brought in later after the northern were organized, and so on and so forth. So that is very important that we make that move. Now in 2011, the Security Perimeter Initiative was announced between Harper and Obama, and my information tells me absolutely little has happened on that file. We now in Canada have drones guarding much of our border with the United States. This is not overkill. We have a passport requirement that has murdered our tourist industry. Tourism fell by 30% the minute the passport requirement was imposed, and it has never come back. That's another industry that likes to have me speak because I'm becoming known as the broken border lady. And the terrorist issue is a real concern, of course. There have been incidents. The first Al-Qaeda incident came out of Montreal. The Millennium Bomber, fortunately, was caught. Homeland Security is a little overly aggressive, perhaps, on the border. That's part of it. And there is the other problem, and that is drug interdiction on the Canadian side of the border has been very lax, absolutely non-existent in some jurisdictions, namely British Columbia, which has an enormous industry in marijuana export, which may be legitimized once it's made legal everywhere, which probably will happen. But nonetheless, this, of course, invites in other kinds of unsavory production. And so according to the RCMP website of 2 years ago, Canada was the largest exporter of meth and ecstasy in the world. And these operations are set up in remote places, Manitoba border, British Columbia border, in the Indian reserves in Ontario, and wherever they straddle the border. So we have a real binational issue. And we also have a complexity issue. I talk about the Detroit-Windsor Bridge problem. This is a choke point in the world's most busy trade crossing. A choke point that is causing a lot of people in the auto parts business to move from Canada to the United States, or to boost up their production in the United States as opposed to in Canada. So this doesn't seem to be resolvable when in actual fact all that needed to have happened was for the US and Canada to expropriate the bridge, pay the gentleman what he deserved, and get rid of the problem. The fact that it's dragged on this long, and now Canadian taxpayers are paying $2 billion to build a highway and to a bridge that may never be built, is really a testimony to the fact that our border is broken, the relationship is not what it should be, and it needs tending, and it needs to be fixed very quickly. And again, my solution to fixing the border is get rid of it. And the security perimeter, of course, would do that. The Europeans have done that. They've been able to finesse, it's taken them a long time, they've been able to finesse the fact that they have 28 different cultures, legal systems, healthcare systems, tax systems, and they have no border. And that has, of course, been very helpful economically. So these are the underpinnings for the reason why I wrote the book. My solutions are in the book in the form of a thought experiment, economic models, political models. If someone else can come up with a better, different one, that's great. My guess is that the most likely result will be we probably will get, if conversations continue in places like this in the United States and in Canada, we can maybe get rid of the border and move toward the next step of from free trade, which is a customs union. Caribbean has done that. West Africa's been able to do that. The Europeans have been able to do that. And here are two countries more similar than any of those combined collectively. And we have a border that's getting worse, not better, after 26 years. The background for myself is that I immigrated. I was born and raised in Chicago. I immigrated at 19. I married a British guy. We moved to Toronto. And I have also seen an enormous transformation in the two countries. Not only is the United States a lot different than it was in the late 60s. I mean, you think about civil rights, women's lib, gay rights, the liberalization, more progressive politics, more progressive voting patterns. The polling is different and more similar to the Canadian polling on a national basis. And Canada has transformed. When I moved to Toronto, it was a little British city, very provincial. The country, and I wrote my first book in '86 about it, was heavily concentrated from an economic point of view. 32 families, dynastic families mostly, 5 conglomerates and 5 banks controlled just virtually the entire economy, hiding behind tariff barriers. And they had unusual and unfortunate access to the political levers of the country. And so that had, and I wrote that book, and I exposed that level of concentration of power, and then recommended free trade with the Americans and, of course, the GATT process. And, of course, that did happen, and that has made all the difference. So I wrote a sequel to that book in 2008, Who Owns Canada Now? And I profiled the 75 billionaires and the landscape of at that time. A few died and gone bust. But the landscape had completely changed. The wealthy people were in all sectors. Conglomeration had stopped. People were specialized. Free trade had opened up and created a meritocracy. And I would say that of the 75 billionaires at that point in time, most of them were self-made, not dynasties, and many of them, almost half of them, were immigrants who were not born in the country and had started off very impoverished childhoods. So the country had transformed in 2 generations. In Canada, to become more American, it became also much more multicultural than it was in that period of time. And the United States has become a bit more liberal and progressive. And so I sort of saw this, even though they have become more similar, I would say going from distant cousins to distant siblings, they are not the same. And I would say that the overriding difference, and I sort of realized this in the writing of the book and also analyzing my background, is that Canadians have, no matter what their ethnic background, a British sensibility. So how you dress, how loudly you speak, whether you brag or not, your manners, your deportment, your interrelationship with other people is very British, irrespective of their ethnic background. Americans are Germanic sensibility. Direct, more blunt, a terrific work ethic compared to Anglo-Saxon countries. Good at manufacturing and engineering and technology. And so that is one of the reasons why Americans, like me, rub Canadians the wrong way. And that is why Germans rub the French and the British the wrong way as well. And so these traits are very interesting. So I looked at the American census figures, and the latest census showed that 18% of all Americans said that they had German background. Not partial German background, 18%. And so that's 18% of the population, excluding Hispanics and African Americans and Asians. So that is a big chunk of the population, of the Caucasian part of the population. And I would say that if you included those that were partially German or those who had changed their names because of one of the two wars, from Braun to Brown or from Schmidt to Smith, or Mueller to Miller, you would find a larger swath of German background people. And I named a lot of in the book, in the foreword, I name a lot of the famous Americans, the American Bush, the American presidents. Obama's mother was half German, Nixon's, and all of these folks. And this is a sensibility, not opinions, but a sensibility difference. And that is another major divide between the two countries in terms of cultural style. The merger is underway, and here are some factoids that I'll give you, and then I'm going to end it here. 3 million Americans live full or part-time in the United States. Canadians, sorry. Thank you. Roughly 2 million American residents were naturalized Canadians because you had to choose before '78. That's a rough guess. That's a very large percentage of the Canadian population. Not the same, of course, percentage as Mexico has, as Mexicans that have immigrated to the United States. In the 20th century, 7 million, these are the official records, but who knows the unofficial, 7 million Canadians immigrated to the United States. The population was about 7 million at the outset of that century. I would say that, again, rough guess, if you asked American residents, if you polled American residents with one Canadian parent, you would get a very large figure. If you asked Americans if they had a Canadian grandparent, you could get the population of Canada. This includes Hillary Clinton and Sarah Palin, who had grandparents who were Canadian. And so you've got an enormous reach into the country, and that kind of also is a form of socio-merger. Of course, we know we marry, we do business together, we study together, we play together, we invest in one another's countries. We are the largest buyers of real estate, personally, in the United States, Canadians, for the last 4 years. We are the third largest FDI investor. The Americans are by far the largest. 90% of our exports or so go to the U.S. Canadians buy more products from and goods and services from the United States than the whole European Union combined. So there's this integration. 12% roughly of the Canadian economy is owned by American companies. And of that 12%, it's almost 100% of the manufacturing export sector. It's 50% of the oil sector, a whack of the mining sector. And interestingly, 60% of all the retail dollars, non-groceries spent in the United States are spent in American stores by Canadians. 60%. And so that is kind of the situation right now. The brain drain continues apace. About 250,000 Canadians get green cards every decade now. That's the population of Quebec City. These things are very troublesome for Canada, and the border thickening, of course, is a real worry, and it's reflected in some strains in businesses and, as I say, a readjustment. So those are kind of the big major themes, that there is a merger underway. I think a merger of some description is inevitable. And again, to change the quote of Will Ferguson, keep the Americans out, the French in, and hope the natives somehow disappear. My book really is about letting the Americans into the extent Canada's comfortable with it. Don't worry about the French. They either will go or they'll stay. And for goodness sake, we have to do something about the natives, because the land claims are real, unresolved for the most part, and are a real drain and drag on anybody, a merged U.S.-Canada or Canada developing its resource base. So thank you very much for being attentive, and away we go. We're doing
Away we
panel.
go. Well, Diane, you've given us the background of why Canada is like it is now, and sort of a little bit why the Americans are the way they are. And I think the German thing is a very interesting thought, something to think about. So you've got us to today, And I wonder if you could just very quickly go through some of the scenarios, the might-be's. Take a
Okay.
couple of time to do that, and then we'll get into some discussion with with the panelists.
Okay, that's an excellent question. Yeah, there's a couple of flashpoints coming up, again, that are existential challenges for Canada. Number one is Keystone. Make no mistake, this is not just a pipeline, and a lot of that oil can be transported by rail, although the environmental movement is attacking that too, and there's some very serious concerns everybody has concerning that. And the knock-on effects of that is already being felt in the mining and the agriculture business. Canada's grain companies lost big contracts in China recently because their grain isn't being carried by the two railroads in Canada in favor of carrying oil. Potash is having the same problem getting out. And so we have some bottlenecks developing. And the First Nations issues are going to be an impediment, certainly in building a pipeline from the oil sands to the Pacific for Asia and also across the country. It'll be a First Nations issue, an environmental issue, but also a Quebec issue. And that's the other flashpoint. We have an election on April 7th. A very high-profile businessman with a lot of credibility has joined the cause, which is in and of itself not that significant because I think he's got a bit of a tin ear. Like most business-rich guys who run for politics, they really don't know how to play the game, and he's already kind of put his foot in it. However, what it means to me is it means that Quebecers of non-traditional support for separation are coming out of the closet and saying, yeah. So this is a different ballgame. Will they win a majority? Yes, possibly. I don't know. And if they get a nice majority, they will go for the third referendum. And will they pull it off this time? They came 20,000 votes from pulling it off 20 years ago. I wrote my 6th book about that battle. And so you've got that flashpoint looming, and in Quebec a unity crisis. You've got, and if Keystone doesn't happen and the rail option is not an option, and the pipelines continue to be a barrier, you've got a situation where Alberta hits the wall in about 18 months. All of the expansion production, which is a long-term bet, will start to wind down. And 90% of the jobs created last year in Canada were created in the oil sands by Alberta. These are some very serious issues. The thickening of the border is another serious economic issue for Canada. So these are, going forward, these are flashpoints. These are going to create a lot of soul searching in Canada and a lot of political revisionism. And sitting out there now, because of my book and all the work I've been doing in promoting it, is that other option. Well, let's fast track integration with the United States and we can eliminate a couple of these problems. No border, Keystone gets built.
Okay, then. Well, we are very happy today. I'm very happy today to have a series of experts to sort of take Diane's ideas and run with them a little bit. Our first panel, we've got Michael Geary, who was a fellow with us for a while, and he's continuing on as a global fellow, and Kevin Lees from Suffragio, who has a lot to say as well. So let me turn over to Michael first and see what you have to say, and then Kevin, and then we'll get into some conversation.
Great, thanks David, and the Canada team here at the Wilson Centre for having me here to discuss Diane's book. I have to start by saying that, I'm not American, I'm not Canadian, I'm Irish, and I suppose I feel a little offended that, we don't talk more, or Diane didn't mention more, about all of the Irish Americans currently in Obama's cabinet, including Obama himself. And we have the pictures of him with a pint of Guinness to prove that he is at least half, or a quarter, or a third, or a fifth, or a tenth Irish. My contribution to the book discussion, I want to touch upon some of the arguments that Diane mentions in the book. This case for a merger, and rather than agree with the book's thesis that Canada and the United States should merge, I will respectfully disagree with the position, but I do admit that the book does present a very interesting thought exercise, a thought experiment, in a world where trade relations are, I suppose, increasingly being consolidated. And we see this with TTIP and the Trans-Pacific Agreement that are currently being negotiated. I think, from my perspective as an expert on the European Union and transatlantic relations, looking at the idea of integration of a political merger, I think what I would like to focus a bit more on are these models that Diane talks about in the book. Although it would have been, I think the book could perhaps have benefited a bit more if it had developed more on the concepts of the models, like, for example, a German federal system or the EU or Switzerland and so on. So an appropriate model for Canada and the United States in the absence of an actual political merger where, erasing the border and simply just creating the United States of something. While the European Union in its absolute form today is not one I would recommend, aspects of the EU and its policy framework certainly I think could benefit the Canadian-American relationship. But before I get into more of the specifics, I think reading the beginning of Diane's book got me thinking a lot about the 1920s in Europe, because Diane traces some of the early ideas on the issue of a merger. And in the 1920s in Europe, it brought to mind, I suppose, Europe's recent past over the last 100 years, and many ideas in Europe that were floated on the subject of European integration, especially after the First World War. A lot of ideas on greater economic and political integration as a result of the carnage after 1919. So between 1919 and 1945, you have a huge amount of ideas floating on how to create this kind of a united European state. To the forefront of this was the Austrian politician Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, who advocated closer integration. Through his Pan-Europa movement, founded in the early 1920s, that strongly advocated the notion of a united European state. And as a movement, it had some very, very notable members, including Albert Einstein, Konrad Adenauer, Sigmund Freud, yes, Germans, Thomas Mann, another German, but also notable French leaders such as Georges Pompidou. But this was an elite-driven exercise, an elite-driven movement that did not attract much critical support on the ground. It was a top-down movement. I use the terms, in looking at Diane's book, merger and integration somewhat interchangeably. Between the 1950s and the present day, many European countries decided, for various reasons, to give up some, but not all, of their sovereignty in certain policy fields. And much of this has taken place in economic and monetary fields, with a great deal more cooperation in the areas of justice and home affairs and in defence and foreign policy cooperation. What emerged out of the many ideas and plans for European integration during the post-1945 period to the present day was the creation of what we have today, the European Union, which is an economic and political partnership, not a political union, of 28 countries. The borders do exist, they're just not manned. Despite calls for decades to create a United States of Europe, that federal dream has long died. The European Union has economic integration without political integration. Diane mentions this in the book. She talks about this being an element of the current crisis. I would somewhat disagree there, but nevertheless, the supremacy and legitimacy of the nation state has not been challenged, and federalists are a rare breed in Brussels today. One issue I think that I think is important in looking at Diane's book is I would change the term merger and replace it with enhanced cooperation. I think
Is that Canadian?
Enhanced cooperation. And I think perhaps the book should, well, of course, in light of more recent events, when we're redrawing this map and we erase the border, we also need to make sure that we give back Alaska to the Russians and then, approach it from that perspective, because I'm sure Vladimir will want Alaska back as well. And then we can proceed. But nevertheless, the book talks a lot about the spendthrift Southern Europeans, alludes to the good Northern Protestant work ethic. And I think this is rather inaccurate, because after the Maastricht Treaty, the European Union had, with the Stability and Growth Pact, set down strict conditions for membership of the single currency. Most countries that ended up in the single currency in 1999, including France and Germany, managed to get into the single currency largely because of creative accounting, shifting pension funds and so on to meet the monetary targets by 1999. So in the 2000s, it was not a case that the European Union had no oversight. It was that the regulators, including the European Central Bank and the national financial regulators, were simply asleep at the wheel. I would therefore argue that enhanced cooperation rather than a merger is the way forward for Canada and the United States. Midway through the book, Diane talks about, or I'm quoting, if the economics of a deal work, then the political planets will align. That theory, I argue, hasn't worked in the European Union, and I would wonder how it would work if this was put into place in North America. The Europeans have been trying for 60 years to move towards ever closer union. That idea has long died. Now we have moved much more into the realm of enhanced cooperation. And I think there is a lot that the Americans and the Canadians can learn from certain elements of the European Union. And perhaps the book could have benefited from looking closer at certain elements of this. One area, of course, is justice and home affairs. Diane does mention in the book the European arrest warrant, which is really an amazing piece of European, indeed international legislation passed after 9/11, rammed through the European Council and European Parliament, where now an individual of any of the member states can be arrested and shipped back to the country of the European Union that actually wants him. It's really a phenomenal piece of legislation. And in the issue of justice and home affairs and common foreign security policy, there's huge amounts that the Americans and the Canadians can do to enhance cooperation. Now, on the issue of foreign common security policy, as we've seen in the last few days in Europe, we haven't been very successful in forging a common foreign security policy, largely because the European Union of 28 member states has many countries that are neutral, non-aligned, NATO, non-NATO, and so on, and they all approach foreign policy, and then of course, and Germany, I should say, we all approach foreign policy from very different perspectives. But nevertheless, the Americans and the Canadians could work on enhancing security cooperation, particularly in terms of protecting the Arctic and on the border. One interesting model that they could also consider in terms of taking from the Europeans is the Franco-German model, where in the Franco-German Treaty of 1963, the French proposed a joint Franco-German ministerial council, where the cabinets of both countries would meet twice a year. And this has happened. There's a joint ministerial council held approximately twice a year in the spring and in the autumn. And perhaps this would be a good idea that the Americans and the Canadians would sit down, both cabinets together twice a year, to discuss issues of common concern. And again, particularly on the issue of security. The border then, of course, yes, post 9/11, the border has been a major issue for Canada and America. But again, I would draw both their attention and again, perhaps the book's attention to the common travel area between Britain and Ireland, a travel zone that comprises the islands of Ireland, Britain, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, and the area has internal borders that are subject to minimal or non-existent controls. Now, I am conscious, of course, that security in America is defined somewhat differently than security between Britain and Ireland, notwithstanding the troubles in Northern Ireland. But nevertheless, normally you can travel between Britain and Ireland. Irish and British citizens can travel with only minimal identity documents. Ryanair does require a passport, but for everybody else, a driver's license is more than enough. So the maintenance of this common travel area involves considerable cooperation on immigration matters between British and Irish authorities. Neither of those countries, of course, are part of Schengen. But nevertheless, negotiations perhaps on enhanced cooperation within the area of enhanced cooperation to include something like a common travel area, of course factoring in post 9/11, I think would certainly be make more sense, notwithstanding the fact again that I don't believe a merger actually is possible. On the trade side, the book focuses an awful lot on trade, probably to the detriment of any discussion on the politics of integration, or the politics of a merger, which I think are far more significant than simply just the world is becoming more of a dangerous place, ergo we should erase the border. It seems to me somewhat inconceivable that just because Britain and Ireland share a unique trade partnership that they should merge politically, simply because it makes economic sense. Britain exports more goods to the Republic of Ireland than it does to the future global leading economies, commonly referred to as the BRICS. Is this a reason to merge, notwithstanding 800 years of trying to escape the empire? I think not. But enhanced cooperation in the fields of security and free movement initiatives are very useful tools, and perhaps this is the future of Canadian-American cooperation. There are economic threats, for sure, and the chapter in the book talking about international threats makes that very clear. My question would be, yes, there are international threats, but what about international opportunities? The book doesn't really focus enough on international opportunities. The European Union has dealt with some of these threats themselves. Microsoft, Google, and dominance by these multinational companies in the European marketplace, and the European Commission has taken a very, very hard line. Has fined many of these companies, billions of euro. So there are international threats. I don't think that we should, take them lightly. But nevertheless, the book, I think, perhaps paints somewhat of a dark picture about the world and that America, those countries that are not, I suppose, arguably not that friendly with the United States or Canada. I would perhaps look at it from a different perspective, that not all Chinese investment is bad, not all Russian investment is bad, not all Brazilian investment is bad, and actually that investment is actually quite important. The Europeans are pushing hard for that investment. It seems to me that Canadians, the book at least presents a picture of this very meek and mild country that clearly is incapable of managing its own affairs, and ergo we need to erase the border and get American Germanic thinking integrated there. But why not just focus more on proper regulation, right? Regulatory issues dealing with some of these wayward, I understand, of course, some of these Chinese multinational companies have links with the government in China, and of course that provides them with a buffer. But nevertheless, Europeans have, through competition policy and through other policy frameworks, moved to ensure that there is stricter competition within the single market, to ensure the single market works and there's a free movement of people's goods, services, and so on, capital. So there are multiple models, I think, within the European Union that you could actually use rather than take this kind of a more of a global, more of a definitive approach to erasing the border. And I think the book, yes, it is an excellent thought experiment. It did get me thinking quite a lot on, and I kind of go through the motions between whether I think, could it work or could it not work, but then I do come down to the hard reality that there is a political impairment, that you just do not simply erase borders at the stroke of a pen, that there is, in the European Union, we have gone through 2 world wars, and the legitimacy of the nation state is still there, notwithstanding economic challenges and opportunities and threats and so on. So I would say that the issue of enhanced cooperation is more realistic, more politically realistic than the idea of an actual merger.
Well, thank you, Mike. Diane's book really did get you thinking. Okay.
Very, very much so.
And Kevin, over to you for your thoughts.
Sure. So, I sort of look at this book as sort of two books. The first book, that's sort of the headline book, is the one that's got everyone talking on both sides of the border, the concept of a political merger between the United States and Canada. And in that regard, I agree with Michael that as of right now, that's completely politically untenable. But sort of hiding in plain sight, I think there's another book, and let's call this maybe 2 or 3 dozen really, really thoughtful policy ideas that the United States and Canada could implement tomorrow. And I think, the good news is that policymakers on both sides of the border are very much considering those ideas. Whether that's the concept of sort of going beyond NAFTA, reducing the costs of cross-border transactions, obviously, bringing sort of the scale of U.S. investment into the arena of energy cooperation and greater cooperation for developing the resources of the Canadian North. I think that when you look at one of the best examples is water policy. I was sort of stunned to learn that 60% of the rainwater in North America falls in Ontario and Quebec, even though it has just 6% of the population of North America. So there's an opportunity there, obviously. Engineers and water policy experts believe that some of that rainwater could be diverted to the United States and potentially double the arable amount of arable land in the United States. That seems like, in the words of Tyler Cowen, sort of low-hanging fruit. And there are a lot of examples in this book of the kind of low-hanging fruit that both countries would benefit from in sort of Pareto-efficient ways. I think the book makes a clear case for erasing the border, in whether that's enhanced cooperation or a deeper sort of North American version of the Schengen zone. I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, if you think about airports today in Canada, the infrastructure is almost there. As an American citizen, you go through immigration not when you come back to the United States, but at Canadian airports, and that's true whether you're in Edmonton or Halifax. So I don't think it would take too much political effort to develop a joint effort between sort of U.S. and Canadian immigration officials to sort of develop the capacity of creating something that looks like a North American Schengen zone. Obviously, as we get further away from 2001 and the terrorist attacks, I think the counterterrorism sort of perhaps even overreaction of U.S. officials will subside in time, and U.S. officials will realize that there are plenty of gains to be reaped from sort of facilitating cross-border transactions and ultimately the free movement of workers between Canada and the United States as well. The one security concern obviously is the Arctic, but obviously anyone who's been paying attention realizes that over the next 2 or 3 decades, the Arctic is going to become an area of absolute strategic concern, not just to the United States and Canada, but to Russia, to Europe, to China. Chinese officials aren't going to Greenland today because they have developed a sudden interest in Inuit culture. They see a lot of resources there. So it's a good time it's a particularly good time to be thinking about these issues, I think. Obviously, as the United States and the European Union start, really negotiating TTIP, I think that the Harper government has sort of realized that, if TTIP becomes, more than just reducing tariffs to zero, but actually breaking down regulatory barriers to trade, Canada stands to lose an awful lot of trade with the United States. And that will be displaced by sort of transatlantic trade between the United States and the European Union. So it's sort of, you can understand why the Harper government was so sort of excited to put CETA into place, their own bilateral trade agreement with the European Union. It's not surprising to see that, Canada is excited about, its role as a negotiating partner in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I wouldn't be surprised, but when it's all said and done, if Canada takes an interest in ultimately joining TTIP as well. So it's a really good time to be thinking about these things. As we approach the 2015 parliamentary elections in Canada, the front runner right now is Justin Trudeau, and he's going to be looking for to develop and sort of fill out a policy agenda that includes ideas that sort of position him as someone who's thinking about sort of forward. Sort of the future of Canada and for sort of forward-thinking policies. Obviously, the front runner in the United States for the 2016 presidential election right now seems to be Hillary Clinton, and she's obviously, as well, going to be looking to sort of develop a policy agenda that orients her campaign to the future, not just sort of litigating the sort of concerns of the 90s and the prior Clinton administration or the current Obama administration. But if we turn to the politics, I think that, you know, the political analysis is, it does become more difficult when you add sort of the politics of a potential full-fledged merger between the United States and Canada. And when you start to think of this less as something like an M&A deal and more like, you know, something that would be along the lines of, you know, political negotiation, like the Meech Lake Accords or something like that, you see very quickly how the politics of this would sort of would shut down any serious conversation of a merger. Like, imagine for a moment if the New York Times broke tomorrow that the Obama administration had a white paper on implementing a political merger with Canada. I think you would have, you know, Fox News would go apoplectic for the next month, attacking the Obama administration as selling out, you know, the United States to Canada and paying Canada a price, you know, this lump sum payment for the privilege of doing so. But there, you know, as Diane and Michael have alluded to, there are many cultural differences between the United States and Canada. So, you know, obviously, you know, the difference between the Britishness of Canada and the Germanicness of the United States and the Irishness of the United States. You think about, you know, New Jersey, for example. It's incomprehensible to understand governance in New Jersey without thinking about Italian Americans. It's incomprehensible to think about an American culture, art, and music without thinking about the influence of African Americans. So there are these fundamental differences. And if we think about it in a sort of greater theoretical way, you know, you have to sort of turn to Seymour Lipset, who, you know, famously wrote, you know, years ago that the big difference between Americans and Canadians is that the United States was founded in revolution and Canada was founded in evolution. And I think that goes not just to politics, but the fundamental culture differences of both countries. And so, you know, the way that Canadians approach the role of the state, for example, or, you know, institutions of government is very, very different than the way that that Americans do. So, you know, when you think about, you know, I sort of, you know, that being said, I sort of go back to the internet meme from around 2004 after the re-election of George W. Bush, and there was a map going around that showed, you know, California, so the West Coast and part of the East Coast, and Illinois breaking off and joining with Canada to be the United States of Canada, and then the rest of it was just Jesus land. It was just sort of shorthand for the, you know, cultural, socially, and economically conservative sort of political heartland in the United States that was very much more supportive of the Bush administration than the rest of America. But I think that's, you know, that's sort of lazy thinking because, you know, as Diane mentioned, the United States has shown, you know, in the election of Barack Obama in 2008 that it's not, that it's willing to endorse, it's willing to vote for full-throated American liberalism. You know, if you look at what political scientists have to say, they believe that the millennial generation is going to predominantly and sort of disproportionately vote for Democrats, you know, for the coming decades based on past voting trends of prior generations and sort of how generations lock into voting patterns at a sort of relatively early age. Obviously, the changing ethnic and racial composition of the United States, just like in Canada, is sort of shaping politics in new ways. And you don't have to believe that, you know, ethnic and racial minorities in the United States will continue voting for the Democratic Party in the same, you know, high numbers as they do today to realize that, you know, the Republican Party may have to shift somewhat toward the center or toward the left in order to regain power. In the same token, Canada has sort of shifted rightward a little bit over the past 30 years. If you look at Alberta, I think Alberta today probably has much more in common with Wyoming than it does with Quebec. It's the fourth, you know, most populous province in Canada. In the sort of, in terms of provincial politics there, the choice is between the right and sort of the far right. In terms of the contest between sort of the progressive conservatives who have been in power for over 4 decades and sort of the upstart Wild Rose Party, which is much more economically conservative, much more socially conservative. In fact, a lot of people have sort of compared it to the American Tea Party movement. And there's some commonalities there, but it's definitely a much more robust prairie conservatism than anything you would ever have seen from sort of the old Toryism of the progressive conservatives in the 1960s. If you look at Saskatchewan today, the Conservative Party linked up with some more center-right members of the Liberal Party to form the Saskatchewan Party, and it's been in power for, I think, 7 years now. And in the last election, it won 64% of the vote, and I think it has 5/6 of the seats in the Legislative Assembly in Saskatchewan. If you look at what Stephen Harper has done over the past decade, he took two disparate, conservative traditions, sort of birthed them into a merged conservative party. Then he made that party competitive. Then he won a minority government, and now he's won a majority government. So, it's Canada is not necessarily the bastion of liberalism or socialist healthcare death panels that many Americans might assume it would be. Another great book that was released last year called The Big Shift by the Globe and Mail reporter John Ibbotson and Daryl Bricker, who's a pollster for Ipsos. They argue that this Laurentian consensus is coming to an end, and that in the 21st century it's going to be a lot easier for conservatives in Canada to assemble a majoritarian electoral coalition. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously, they point to the growing importance of Ontario. They point to the sort of entrepreneurial spirit of the very much growing immigrant class in Canada. And I think that when you look at the 20th century, the Liberals were in power 69 out of 100 years. That's just 2 years shy of the record of the PRI in Mexico. So if you're making bets, I think it's probably safe to bet that the Liberals aren't going to repeat that record in the 21st century. So that's probably a safe bet. But the fact of the matter is that when you think about the politics of a merger, maybe the difference between the United States and Canada is much less than we think. That being said, I do agree with the book that the two most recalcitrant opponents of a merger are conservatives in the U.S. South and sort of liberal, sort of statist separatists in Quebec. But when you think about when you sort of go through the thought experiment of the political analysis of how you might bring these groups to the table, I think that when I started thinking about it, I think that it might actually be easier to bring conservatives into a deal like this. When you think about, if tomorrow we created a super Congress of the United States of Canada and America, and you just sort of smushed together the House of Commons and, added those 301 ridings to the United States House of Representatives, not only would sort of the Republican conservative coalition sort of still have a majority, they would increase that majority. Because right now, obviously, Harper's conservatives control 161 seats in the House of Commons. And combined, the Liberals and the slightly more progressive NDP control, I think, 135. So, it's not sort of, I think, an assumption that a lot of Americans would make. It's not true that a merger between the two countries would necessarily, sort of doom conservatism. There are a lot of good arguments that it could strengthen conservatism, and sort of the moderation of the Conservative Party in Canada might actually make the Republican Party in the United States much more electable. I think if you look at the state level, a lot of governors would obviously, look to provinces and say, gosh, I'm a little bit jealous of the power and the autonomy that provinces have. I'd sure like to have their budgets. So you think about the differences between, the Mormon governor of Utah, Gary Herbert, trying to have a conversation with, the first openly LGBT premier of Ontario, of Canada, Ontario's Kathleen Wynne. There are a lot of cultural differences there. You try to imagine a conversation between someone like Texas Governor Rick Perry and Quebec Premier Pauline Marois. I'm not even sure that his French and her English are good enough for them to have a really substantive conversation. So there are really big obstacles here. But on the same token, if you dig a little bit deeper, you think, well, Texans among Americans, many Texans think of themselves as Texans first. Americans as a close second, in sort of the same way that the Quebecois think of themselves as, Quebecers first, French speakers second, and Canadians last. But, obviously that manifests itself much, much differently politically and, say, culturally. But folks like, I'm sure that, Rick Perry and folks like Nikki Haley and other conservative governors in the South wouldn't mind having, some sort of concept of the notwithstanding clause in the whatever constitution would emerge in a political merger, right? So I think there are chips on the table that could induce U.S. conservatives to join a merger. Much more difficult, I think, is the issue of Quebec. And, obviously it's in the middle of an election campaign right now. Pauline Marois announced on, I think, March 5th, snap elections. And the conventional wisdom just a few days ago was that she was going to easily win a majority government on the strength of this debate over sort of a cultural wedge issue, the Charter of Values. Well, now the sort of conventional wisdom has now been upended, right? There was a poll yesterday that showed the Quebec's Liberal Party 2 points ahead, and obviously with the introduction into the race of this new businessman, Pierre-Carl Pelado, it sort of reintroduced the idea of sovereignty. It's made this election, as long as the narrative remains the same over the next sort of 2 weeks, this is going to be an election more about sovereignty, more about independence than any provincial election, probably since the '95 referendum. I think that a lot of Canadian Federalists thought that Marois represents sort of the last gasp of this generation of Quebecois leaders like Lucien Bouchard, Jacques Parizeau, Gilles Duceppe, that sort of came of age during the Quiet Revolution in Quebec in the 1960s, and that the independence movement would sort of die out just as soon as they were, as soon as this generation sort of leaves power. But I think that's more wishful thinking than anything else, and I think that to think about a merger between Canada and the United States is sort of audacious when, sort of the merger between English and French Canada has sort of been fraught for the past 350 years. So this is an issue that didn't go away with the end of the French and Indian War. I don't think it's an issue that's going to go away now. And if you look at a figure like Pelado, he was born in 1961. He is a bit younger. He represents sort of the new generation. If you look at, someone like Xavier Dolan, a young filmmaker in Quebec, he thinks of himself as a Quebecois filmmaker first, not a Canadian filmmaker, and he's, sort of a very strong supporter of the PQ. Well, he's only 24 years old. He was just a toddler at the time of the last referendum. So I think that, the idea of, you think about how much Canada federally has had to give to Quebec over the past, half century in order to maintain a union between Quebec and Ontario and the rest of Canada. Just think how much that, the sort of merged superstate of the United States and Canada would have to give to keep it in a sort of a political merger with Texas and South Carolina. Obviously, it's no longer 1980, it's no longer 1995 in Quebec or in Canada. The bicultural question in Canada has now become a multicultural question. So, as noted, Toronto is incredibly diverse. Ontario is incredibly diverse. The amalgamated Toronto, half of the population there is foreign-born today, over half. If you go to British Columbia, 25% of the population speak neither French nor English, but a third language. So, Canada has changed, and I think that one of the issues now is sort of on the other side of things. The rest of Canada may be sort of losing patience with the Quebecois question as well. So, if you look down the road, and if Quebec ultimately separates from Canada, maybe that becomes maybe there's a new opportunity to talk about political merger. So, all of a sudden you would have perhaps conceivably sort of Western Canada and Ontario geographically separated from the rest of Atlantic Canada. And so you have to wonder, well, maybe there's an opportunity there for political merger. And you think back to the 1940s when Newfoundland was sort of thinking about its status. And for a brief period, there was a very popular movement for Newfoundland to join the United States. That ultimately didn't happen. But I think a lot of those questions would sort of return if Quebec actually does pursue independence and we're looking at a post-secession Canada. So today, I think that obviously political merger between the two countries doesn't work. But the good news is there are a ton of great policy ideas in here that that don't require political merger that could be implemented tomorrow. That would be low-hanging fruit for both countries.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, Diane, as you can see, you've got us thinking. Kevin and Michael thought a lot. You want to react.
just quickly, and we're going to take questions then, or have a break, or?
I think we'll switch things up, get you guys in, and then we'll have a free-for-all.
Okay. A couple of things that I wanted to say is that the 6th chapter of this book explains how the politics makes it impossible to merge and why. But the regionalization of the two countries is very important. It's very, I think, inappropriate to characterize a Canadian or an American. A little back of the envelope calc I did recently was if I looked at, and we know that the border states and the ones I crunched all the numbers of the presidential cycles going back to '92, and the votes for Democrats at the presidential level back to '92 of those states varied for between 60 and 65% of the economy of the United States voted Democratic back to 1992. So the progressiveness is happening. But I looked at the 6 New England states, the 5 Pacific Northwest, so-called, and Minnesota and Wisconsin that are clearly progressive states in terms of their voting patterns federally. They have a population roughly of Canada's, 36 million, and their laws and crime rates are the same as Canada's. So you have another little mini Canada, if you like, on the U.S. side of the border. And the outlier regions, and as I talk about it in the book, the Republicans, joining up like the Germans did, where you just merge. You could make allowances for Quebec as a commonwealth rather than a state, but this is only going to happen, as it only happened in Germany, quickly because of a crisis. And the unity crisis is possible if there is a referendum that's successful. We do have, therefore, the conditions for a great deal of soul searching. And one of the ideas that I posit here is that Canada, in relationship to the United States, has the same attitude, a colonial attitude, as Quebec has toward Canada. And that is, they do a lot of whining, we really don't like you, we're really not the same, we're a little better than you, a little smug, but we're not prepared to go on our own yet or defend ourselves. We can't defend ourselves, but we'll rely on you, but we'll resent you. And I think that much of that same attitude has been adopted in the English Canadian, if I can call it the English-speaking Canadian part of Canada toward the United States. We're a little better than you, we're a little smug, we really don't like you, we don't want to be part of you, but thanks very much for your Navy and your Air Force and NORAD, because we have a Navy with 8,500 people in it and the biggest coastline on the planet. So, this is the kind of thing that could really suddenly swirl around and change minds. And, I don't want to even say that's going to happen, but we don't know what's going to happen. This is called merger of the century. We have a lot more years in the century. And I think it's already kind of inevitable. And on the political side, I just want to say I'm a conservative, small c in Canada. I'm a conservative spokesman. I'm the guru of the Reform Party merging with the Progressive Conservatives. I'm a conservative. I am left of the Democrats in the United States. So there is that other difference when you're looking at anything political in Canada. It is left, and lefter compared to the U.S. and never the twain. But then again, on the other hand, if you look at the northern tier states, the border states, and those states that vote Democrat in the presidential cycles, you see on polling, which I have in the 6th chapter, the polling on everything from capital punishment, same-sex marriage, legalization of marijuana, even gun control is very similar nationally, U.S., Canada. And this is interesting. And of course, it's mostly coming from the border states, the tiers, which are the richest, most educated part of the country. But that's my bias showing.
Okay, we're going to make some room for the other guys, and then they're going to give short presentations, then we'll get into a bigger conversation here. So if Michael and Kevin don't go far, just sort of pick a seat there, and I'll shift.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Yeah, even more, yeah.
We're going to talk about Mexico now.
Okay. Next up is part of the conversation. We have,
I'd be pleased to be
Ms.
Michael
Wilson?
Geary, but I couldn't pull it off.
You have a very good Irish accent.
no,
Well, it's
no,
close
no,
to St. Patrick's Day, Michael.
No, Chris, Kent Hughes. There you
Thanks.
go. My colleague Chris Wilson from the Mexico Institute and my colleague Kent Hughes, who formerly wore many hats at the center. The latest, I think, was the director of Celtic Studies here. So with that, their bios are in the sheets there, and I'll turn it over to Kent.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Diane, for, as everyone has said, a very thought-provoking book. And someone with cousins in Brampton, just outside Toronto, I see this sort of easy connection that so many Americans do have. And having been identified as former head of the Celtic Studies, I do have to raise one eyebrow about this German sensibility that being of Welsh descent, I was considerably disappointed not to see more emphasis on the enormous role that the Welsh have played in coal and steel, and of course many presidents being whole or in part of Welsh descent. Well, I really did enjoy the book. I did find it thought-provoking because it not only got you thinking about where two very close neighbors might be going in the future, but also you took a look at a number of other federal systems around the world. And you have India, you have Canada, you have, in a sense, a federal system, despite what Michael said, being emerging, I think, over time in Europe. Looking at Germany with a federal system, what can we, the U.S., learn about improving our own approach to federalism? Well, I was asked not to talk so much just about could there be a merger, but let's assume the merger has taken place. How does this affect the united countries, and how does it affect that united group going forward in terms of its global role? Well, I think the impact would be in many ways much more political than it would be initially economic. That Canada is about 10% of the United States. That would be significant. I think you're right. That would ease the flow of investment capital going into developing raw materials. But I think the significant impact would be in not just being more Democrats possibly or more conservatives, but a somewhat different sense of community, that probably this merged country would find it easier to move toward, let's say, truly universal health care. And in some ways, that merger, that move to universal health care, would, I think, improve the soft power of this combined country. That one of the things that shocked people with the financial crisis and the sudden focus on America was not only that we had messed up what had been a really point of pride for the United States, but suddenly people realized with the Obama administration we did not have universal health care. We were alone in the OECD world, and people thought, well, gee whiz, is that really a city on the hill where they don't even have health care for everyone? The second impact, I think, would be possibly pushing us back toward our pragmatic roots. That in Diane's book, she really does note that in many ways our current policies ignore our much more pragmatic past. You go back, for example, to Abraham Lincoln, who in the middle of the Civil War stimulated the development of the railroads and created the whole land-grant college system. Many of those land-grant colleges are now what they call Tier 1 research universities and the source of an enormous amount of innovation. You have the example, of course, of the GI Bill. You have Eisenhower building the interstate highway system, which kind of acted in a way like the common market in Europe, that ease of transportation helped knit what were still largely regional economies together. So I think moving us back to that pragmatic past, that shared pragmatic past, would make it easier to respond to one of the things that Diane emphasizes, which is the need to respond to what I would call the East Asian miracle countries. Started with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, China now being the latest example of countries that have thrived by building on a different set of assumptions than those that underlay the initial GATT when it was from General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which more or less assumed that period being right after World War II, you were going to have relatively limited government intervention and essentially free competition among private companies. Clearly, the East Asian countries have found a different formula, which has worked well for them and perhaps not always as well as they confronted a very different GATT-like system here in the United States and Europe and some other places. I think that you do want to think of these very different sensibilities. One of the Oxford histories of the United States refers to America as the restless giant. I don't get the sense that Canada is as restless as we are. We tend to be a mobile country. It's Los Angeles, opportunity, let's give it a shot. And that element that Diane emphasizes, the culture of risk-taking, where if you're in Silicon Valley, failure is basically not trying again. And you hear lots of people who will say, oh, didn't work, made it on my 6th try, that kind of thing. And that sense that there's no shame in failure, that really is the shame of not trying again. And that would be something that would be perhaps a bit of a shock to Canadians, although less so than we think, hence the brain drain. People have seen that opportunity here, and those restless people have certainly come here. I gave just 1 minute of thought to steps that might move us to what Michael so eloquently referred to as enhanced cooperation. One, that we could have a much more unified travel system. We could start partnerships among universities in which there could be much greater exchange. There could be, of course, and this thinking was stimulated when Quebec flirted much more seriously, or maybe they will again, with leaving, and people were saying, well, what if Alberta wanted to join, or what if Saskatchewan wanted to join? And there was not very serious thinking, but a view here, naive, uninformed, will be better informed thanks to your book, of saying, well, the provinces are sort of like states, what's the problem? Coming from Pendleton, Oregon, which is famous, feels it's famous for the Pendleton Roundup, one of the biggest rodeos in North America, we feel an easy comradeship with our co-rodeo fans in Calgary. So there would be a sense that this would not be so hard. I think that we would probably benefit from a shared pragmatic thinking about foreign direct investment. One thing I noticed in your book, you had a lot of emphasis on raw materials and agriculture and energy. Well, one of the biggest challenges, I think, for us going forward will be investments in the technology sector. Because in the end, if country A and country B have come in and bought a lot of your petrochemical industry, and there suddenly is tension with countries A and B, you can send in the Mounties or send in the Marines and renationalize that. But with technology, it can go immediately. So I think that would stimulate a kind of useful shared thinking. And of course, Congress could, in theory, create a common citizenship that it wouldn't be guaranteed in the Constitution, but Congress could, for instance, decide that individuals who had emigrated here when they were children could be granted citizenship, and the same approach could be taken, and perhaps on a limited basis, with regard to Canada. With regard to monetary union, that would certainly be possible. Other countries use the dollar, and I don't see any reason why the Fed couldn't meet more regularly with its counterpart in Canada, and perhaps if there really were a full merger, you'd have another one of the members of the Federal Open Market Committee. Well, let me just turn to your final push about merge like Germany, govern like Switzerland, and think like China. I think you have to remember that Americans have a real reverence for the Constitution. We really believe that we have inherited rights, and that changing that Constitution is certainly possible. It has been amended a very few times, but that would be a challenge for the German approach. In terms of Switzerland, suggesting another layer of government will have a visceral negative reaction in the United States. We've got enough government would be the overwhelming reaction. But your thinking about China, if I interpret your thinking about China, is that it's about time that we had a North American strategy with regard to growth, innovation, manufacturing, and so forth. I think there's some real wisdom to that suggestion. Thank you.
All right. And thank you, Kent. And now, Chris.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the Canada Institute for the invitation to take part in the event. Congratulations, Diane, on a very interesting and clearly very thought-provoking book. I think that maybe it can best be understood as more of a, rather than a policy idea, a policy provocation, and clearly it's worked in that effect on us. So I think that I'll, as such, respond in kind and be a little bit provocative in my response, coming from the Mexico Institute, thinking about where Mexico's role might be in North American integration. But first, a broader reflection. When I first started thinking about this book and how to respond and talk about it here, I wasn't sure how seriously to take the idea, right? I wasn't sure how serious of a proposal it is, more of a thought experiment in the theoretical conceptual sense, or in the let's put this on the table sense. And so I went and tried to do a little bit of reading of how you've talked about the book before. And I found actually that for the most part, you propose it in a serious way, but at the same time, I found this passage in an interview with the Wall Street Journal that I thought was pretty interesting. He said, if the book does nothing else, it starts a conversation in the two countries centering on how important they are to each other, which is very often forgotten. We've got to make Americans realize that one of their best future strategies for jobs, energy independence, security is to be nice to their neighbors and make them happy. And I really agree with that. I mean, I really think that one of the really important contributions that this book makes is putting on the table, putting in the conversation, in the political discussion here in the U.S., in really discussions everywhere in the U.S., just how important our relationships with our neighbors are. I think you can't overstate it. I mean, it's just so clear in an economic sense, as you demonstrate throughout the book, how important those relationships are, but in a security sense also, and even the depth of cultural ties, I think, are extremely important. So we need in the United States to understand that even though we're a big country, much bigger than our neighbors, our relationships with our neighbors are just fundamental to our security and economic prosperity. And I think this book contributes quite a bit in that direction. About the role of Mexico in the North American community, one thing that you said in the book that felt very provocative to me was that Mexico should have never been allowed to join NAFTA. And I have to, of course, take issue with this, being from the Mexico Institute and looking so much at U.S.-Mexico relations. As a point of historical clarification, it actually wasn't that Canada and the U.S., who did have the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement before NAFTA, it wasn't that they allowed Mexico to join. That's not what happened. Mexico approached the United States to create a free trade agreement bilaterally with the United States, which was accepted. And then Canada decided that it couldn't be left out, actually. It was worried that perhaps something better would take place there, or that they would be excluded somehow from the conversation if they didn't then join trilaterally with the other two countries to form this North American community, which was, of course, a great idea. And really, in the intervening years, so however we feel about what happened then, in the intervening years, some really important things have happened, and that is that our countries, the three countries of North America, have really become deeply integrated in a way that wasn't the case before NAFTA. And manufacturing is the best place to see this, right? So, we now have systems of co-production where we ship parts and materials across the borders multiple times as goods are being made. The auto sector is really 100% integrated. It's a North American production platform that we have right now that involves all three countries. If you look at the percentage of U.S. content in final goods being imported from Canada and Mexico, they're unlike imports from anywhere else in the world. And from Canada, there's 25% U.S. content in final good imports into the U.S. The only country that has a higher degree of U.S. content in its imports to the U.S. is Mexico, with 40% U.S. content in them. So we really are deeply integrated. But that means that deep level of continental integration that NAFTA has created means that we would really go wrong if we didn't deeply consider how Mexico fits into the equation looking forward in terms of the prosperity, in terms of the security of the United States. And I think that, coming from a Canadian perspective, and I realize that you have both a Canadian and American perspective naturally, but coming from a Canadian perspective, it's very easy to dismiss Mexico as a complicating factor in the discussions about regional integration. But coming from an American perspective, it's really vital to include Mexico in discussions going forward about regional integration. Why? A few reasons. Mexico, okay, let me just lay out a few. Mexico is a gateway to the rest of the Americas. So Mexican migration to and from the U.S. is now actually at net zero, meaning there are as many Mexicans leaving the United States, going back to Mexico, as there are entering the United States. This may change a little bit over time, but there are really some broad, big picture trends that are changing the nature of migration. What that means is that Mexico is becoming largely a pass-through country that Central Americans in particular right now, but people from other nations are using as a gateway to access the United States. This has tremendous strategic importance to the U.S., and of course the U.S. therefore has tremendous interest in cooperating with Mexico on issues of transmigration and migration. A partnership obviously would be able to address issues of transnational organized crime, which is fundamental to the United States and our security. In terms of trajectory, right now, Canada is the United States' largest trading partner. Mexico is the #2 export market for the United States, but Mexico is a nation of 120 million people, much bigger than Canada, growing at a slightly faster rate than Canada. I think within the next couple of years, we'll see that Mexico is trading more with the U.S. in terms of the auto industry than Canada is. Probably within the next decade or so, trading more with the United States than Canada writ large, period. So in terms of U.S. interests, there's actually tremendous reasons to make sure that Mexico is a part of the discussion from a trade perspective. Recently passed energy reform in Mexico will, over the course of several years, increase Mexico's participation in helping meet North America's energy needs. 1 in 10 Americans are of Mexican ancestry. 35 million Americans have Mexican ancestry. I don't think that fact can be ignored in thinking about the politics of integration, and really one of the challenges for Canada in finding relevance here in Washington is something that Mexico doesn't face, largely because of the electoral dimension of how, even now trips by the president to Mexico are considered domestic political opportunities as much as they are opportunities to change foreign policy. And so while there's some elements of the Beyond the Border project that are unique to the U.S.-Canada relationship, there are many aspects of U.S.-Canada relations that are perfectly mirrored on the U.S.-Mexico side. Things like the high-level regulatory cooperation councils mirrored there. The 21st Century Border Initiative is not the same as the Beyond the Border Initiative because the goal is not to create perimeter security, but many of the elements are very similar in terms of trying to both have security and efficiency at our borders at the same time and finding ways to deal with these post-9/11 border challenges. There's really a lot that the two can learn from one another in terms of best practices and ways to manage these asymmetric, challenging relationships with the United States, but hugely important relations with the United States. And recently at the North American Leaders Summit, when the 3 leaders were in Toluca, Mexico, one of the things that they did that was not noticed by very many people was agree to send representatives to one another's meetings. It wasn't clear exactly which ones these would be, but something like a Mexican representative at the Beyond the Border meetings, perhaps a Canadian representative at the 21st Century Border meetings. This is great. I mean, what this is a realization that we can actually have an asymmetric NAFTA, like you say. We don't have to wait with one country or the other to move forward. That's fine. That makes perfect sense. If there are things that the United States and Canada can do today that the United States and Mexico cannot do today, no problem. We should move forward with them, absolutely. But we should not, but in order for that to work, in order for dual bilateralism to function without tearing apart what we've created in North America, we need to ensure that we're on the same track. And the only way to make sure that we're on the same track is to have a strategic vision. We need a roadmap about where we're going. And that roadmap has to be continental, meaning it has to include Mexico. We need a roadmap that strategically understands where the United States, Mexico, and Canada are all trying to get to together. It could be a long-term project. And then, but actually only then, will it be strategically valuable to let one side get ahead of the other. So it doesn't happen in a way that's divergent, but rather convergent in the long term. So that's the slight shift, and I think that it does fit into the way that you were describing things, but the slight shift that I would take on it. Unfortunately, Canada-Mexico ties are the weakest link in North American relations today. Part of that's natural. The level of trade and economic ties between Canada and Mexico have been much lower from the beginning and continue to be much lower. But it's also has to do with this attitude in Canada that Mexico contaminates its relationship with the United States. It has to do with this attitude in Canada, perhaps even a little bit of jealousy about the level of attention that Mexico gets in Washington compared to Canada. And I think that is really holding back what's possible at the trilateral level. And the truth is, there's a lot of possibility for movement at the trilateral level. And right now, Canada is the one that's holding things back. There has not always been in the United States a willingness at the top levels to move forward trilaterally, but right now there is, and there certainly is in Mexico. And what we saw in the most recent North American Leaders Summit is that it was really reluctance on the Canadian part that's the biggest sticking point to advances trilaterally. So I really think that we got to change that attitude so that we can advance further trilaterally, and then at the same time still allow dual bilateralism to move things forward on different tracks. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Anything you want to say, Diane,
Yeah,
before
just quickly, I talk about asymmetrical. The decoupling is the security perimeter talks. That's the beginning of the decoupling, and there's about 7 different steps toward full political union that countries can take. And I'm just saying that we're stalled at number 1, all 3 of us. Canada and the U.S. can go to 2 or 3. Mexico maybe eventually if the planets align for Mexico. The security perimeter, again, also related to what you're saying, and something that you brought up about the EU, is it's very tricky to do because it involves a blending of immigration, tax, customs, and law enforcement, and security, national security policies. And so this is why I think it's been very difficult. It's not a front burner issue in Washington. There's a lot of other things going on. And so I think that this is really what we should all, in the policy world, if we agree, should be having conversations about to push. And so Mexico is it's not about turning their back on Mexico. I'm interested, and I'll talk to you later, as to some kind of, you're saying there's some kind of official Canadian position that is a little bit negative toward Mexico in terms of moving forward. I'm interested in that. I don't know that that's the case on the official level. So very good presentations, and thank you.
Okay, question.
Yeah, so a fascinating panel. Dan Roberts from The Guardian. It seems to me, in a world where the internet and globalization is demolishing borders, whether governments like it or not, that getting the politics to catch up is vital. And so I'd like to take the thought experiment perhaps a bit more seriously than some, not seriously, but I'd like to kind of look at the big idea of a merger and go back to Diane and ask you, could you elaborate a little bit more on what you think the US would gain from a merger? You talked very persuasively, I thought, about what Canada could gain from a merger. How would it benefit America, and what would it do to the dynamics we're seeing in Washington at the moment, where already the country is struggling to accommodate all these very diverse demands? How would they accommodate another country in there?
Well, first of all, I think the most realistic merger is the economic merger, more of an economic merger. If you have that happening, that means that Canada has finally gotten its attitude straight concerning its future, and its future being with the partner to the south. And on the trade side, too, it's interesting to note that Canada is not an exporting nation. It exports a lot, but it's 80% of its exports are intercorporate transfers between American branch plants and American parents. And that's about as high as Sweden. Sweden has the same problem. So as far as the idea of going out and finding export markets are concerned, this has not been Canada's, again, another indication of the fact that the merger is well underway between the two countries. The straight up benefits for a better relationship than we have now, however you want to characterize that, I think getting rid of the border. What that does is it gives mobility to American businesses. It would open up the resource area more than before. If you get rid of the border, I have a whole chapter on synergies, the low-hanging fruit that someone referred to. You could develop cross-border hydroelectric power, tidal, all kinds of projects that could make the two countries, well, certainly the United States, could completely eliminate any imports of oil from anywhere else and also clean up the environment. You could ration out the water to enhance your agribusiness. You could have the synergies of technological advance. Right now, yes, there's 250 or 300,000 Canadians in Silicon Valley, but there's a whole bunch more that would go if they could go. But there are a lot of constraints on immigration, on being legal, and doing that down there. Vice versa, I would submit there would be a lot of Americans who would probably be happy to live in parts of Canada. So you'd get business opportunities, you get economic growth, you'd get huge synergies economically, and you would also get the possibility of the build out of the Arctic. And the Americans, this is an enormous cost. There's not rail, road, seaports, anything in the Arctic. And just to undertake some of the build out for infrastructure that would enhance development and exploration, very large parts of it haven't even been stepped on by a human being, would be an enormous driver, just as the Eisenhower highway system was, to the economy. It would be a Marshall Plan of the hinterland of Canada that the United States could fully participate on. It would be jobs. And then, of course, geopolitically, there would be no one even close to them in terms of influence and clout. Is that helpful? And another person mentioned something quite cute. If you actually politically merge the two, Canadians become the fabric softener for the United States, which is to your point about universal health care, the fleecy, if you like.
Thank you. I'm Mac Dessler, University of Maryland. Very interesting panel. I want to, like the last questioner, want to push our creator of this wonderful controversy a little bit more. Everybody you and everybody have sort of dismissed the political scenarios for integration without talking about them at all. And therefore, those of us who haven't had the privilege yet of reading the book haven't any idea what those ideas might be in terms of what you mentioned there are political scenarios, even though you recognize
I talk a lot about it in the book. So you get.
I wonder if you could give us a capsule summary of maybe a couple
for
of
Republicans like the security benefits of a merger. The Republicans would like the economic benefits of a merger, and the access to resources and all of that a merger would bring. The Democrats would like it because there's 35 million Democrats in Canada. They just think that would be great. So you've got that kind of situation. I did not talk in the book. I assumed that in my thought experiment that the only viable model would be to become states in the United States. So you'd add 13 states to the U.S. mix. Quebec would probably balk. Then you make them a Commonwealth status like Puerto Rico with their own president, their own official language, some more autonomy. I just threw out these ideas. Rewriting two constitutions and blending them into one is impossible. The Germans didn't even attempt that. What they did was they said the only thing that would work is we will amend the West German constitution and the East German Lander will come in under accession clauses, which are in place in the U.S. Constitution, by the way. Anybody can accede into the U.S. Constitution by simple majority of Congress. There's not even a presidential thing
Happened quite a
involved.
lot in our past.
So all of this is possible, but I think you need a crisis for this to happen, or it doesn't. And so is that helpful? I think
yeah.
other interesting structure is, of course, what you do is you get a security perimeter in place. In order to do a security perimeter, now you have a blending of customs, taxation, homeland security, police interdiction, and immigration. Now you've got a fourth level of government, whether you want to call it that or not. You've got binational institutions that babysit and watchdog those different areas. And so now you start to get into a blending and maybe a higher level of government. We already have, I think, 300 treaties between the two countries. I mean, and there's commissions and there's tribunals, and we already have a structure for binational government.
In the back, David Jones, and then this.
I'm Dave Jones. I am a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer. The throwaway line used to be that Canadians are unarmed Americans with health care. Nobody mentioned here at all the problems that would be associated with extending the Second Amendment into any sort of a combined North America. But on top of that, there is another issue which nobody really addressed seriously, which is the incredibly obstructive effort by environmentalists throughout North America to prevent economic development of the sort that we are all touting would be the, say, epitome of what a merger would be. I'm willing to argue that the only way that one would deal with Aboriginal, say, Native America concerns would be if everyone who was not an Aboriginal North America departed. And only that would satisfy this element of the inhabitants of North America. But that's another debatable point. Nevertheless, there are the serious problems of environmental obstructionism and how one would cope with Second Amendment U.S. rights whenever anyone should think about this type of merger.
Yeah, good questions. And this is brought up all the time. Canadians have a right to own a gun, but they don't have it enshrined in the Constitution. Anybody can own a gun in Canada. Anybody can drive a car in Canada, but we have driver's licenses, and the registry is gone on the gun side now. But we have more controls on the retail side and the purchase of a gun. There's a waiting period, a cooling off, a checking. The United States has the Second Amendment, and I don't know why guns aren't the same as cars. You should have a license to drive a car, so you are not a danger to society. You should have a license to have a gun or be checked out anyway. Now, that being said, I don't think it's an issue, because if it is an issue, the merger doesn't happen. That's all. I don't think it's that big an issue, and I have some polling on the gun control versus the right to bear arms, and those are two different issues in the public mind. And gun controls in the U.S. polled as high as they do in Canada, and Canadians were very much against the gun registry, and that was scrapped by the current government, and I don't see any grassroots movement to bring that back. Now, the crime rates have a lot to do with socioeconomic conditions in both countries, and that's a different issue. On the environmental side, my next book is going to be out of Silicon Valley. I could make a good case and argue that in maybe one generation, for sure in two, we will not need fossil fuels anymore. But fossil fuels isn't what you've got in Canada. You've got all the other metals and minerals you need to make iPads, hybrid cars, all kinds of things like that. It's not just about oil. In fact, the oil sands is the only real big bunch of energy deposit in Canada. I would say that, by 2030, with solar panel development, we could be past the age of fossil fuels by 2030 or 2035. And it's not a problem.
Right here.
We save the planet, too.
Byron Beckenstein, University of Maryland. We've talked about political and economic factors, but what about the personal? That Americans are notorious for not thinking much or knowing much about Canada, but it's obviously different on the other side of the border. I was in Canada on 9/11, and the people around me acted as if they had been attacked. But how would they feel about having their identity subsumed, no longer being considered Canadians, but Americans?
Well, I think at first blush, people are resistant to it. That's why it's a thought experiment. I'm talking about, these are forms of integration that you can go. I mean, I have 5 economic models of integration. One is an investment banking model where we just, exchange money and that sort of thing. I would say that Canadians are voting with their feet. There's 3 million living in the United States, and there's probably another 2 million, and there's an enormous number of other people that come and go. And I think nationalism is important, but it's based on at what point and at what level. And if you have an economic situation, or you have a social situation or a political situation that requires you to change your loyalty or change your government, people will do that. But it is an issue, absolutely. It is an issue, and that would have to be overcome if anything were to happen. That's why I think if there's a crisis, political union, like Germany. If there's no crisis, I think we move toward a European model.
This brings up a point. I think you alluded to it earlier, that as a thought experiment, I think most of the people in this room are like, this is kind of interesting, and sort of pursuing this line of thought and letting it go through. My Canadian friends are just apoplectic about this book. They won't even entertain the idea.
My children are horrified.
They won't even entertain the idea. It's like, you're having that kook Diane Francis? It's an interesting thought, but I'm just wondering if you could sort of go a little bit deeper into how this has been received in Canada and in the United States. Because it seems pretty rational here.
It's totally rational. And Canadians are, I have 2 of them. Canadians are very much tinged with the anti-American attitude. There's no question. And then also there's the difference in style. I had an interesting chat with a friend of mine, and he runs an investment banking boutique, and he has an office in New York and an office in Toronto. And I said, so I guess you do the closing parties completely differently. And he said, no, I don't. What do you mean? He said, I don't know what to do when there's a closing in the U.S. I said, well, what you do is you make T-shirts up and you go around and say, we're number 1 and we killed those guys and let's bury the next guys. And that's your way of doing it. In Canada, that's not done. That's unseemly. That's good job, chaps. Nice, well done. And, let's hope we fare okay in the next year. And so there's that gloating that, America, it really rubs people the wrong way in Canada. And so that is what it is. We're dealing with stereotypes, but we're also dealing with an actual difference too in style. And so that's why, my kids just, they see the Olympics and they, the bragging and the gloating, it just turns them right off.
Jill?
Thank you for this presentation. I'm Gilles Gauthier from the Canadian Embassy, so I won't comment on the overall proposition from a political merger. I'd be out of job, but but more to the question of the economic and market integration. Why is it that in Canada there is immense support for market integration with the U.S., with economic integration, huge support, whereas in the U.S. it's basically unknown or very little support. In fact, the polls say that about 12 to 15% of Americans know that Canada is their biggest trading partner. So it's very, very, very little knowledge. So I hope you're very successful. You said you're getting a lot of invites across the United States, so maybe that's a message that you can certainly help to convey to our American colleagues. But maybe, why is it that even in the business community, there's not more leadership in terms of recognition of the market integration? Why is it that we will not, for instance, promote some ideas like product of North America? This is the new brand, a new brand, as opposed to going in different way. These are things that might change a bit the mindset about the benefits of the market and the economic integration, and then that could help move along some of the smaller initiatives that you have in your book to facilitate and then do away with the border in some shape or form.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, and you're from Quebec, and it's interesting that in the free trade election of '88, overwhelming support and still comes from Quebec. And I think when you are a more homogeneous, cohesive place, a nation like Quebec, a nation within a country, you're not frightened. You want bigger markets. You want to go for it. If you think, and this is the old British tape, if you think that the Yankee is a problem and we're going to get subsumed and we're completely decapitated because of it, then you're not going to like it. You're not going to like it at all. And I think it's really down at that psychological level. The number of people, and being American, in Canada, and I was married to a British guy for a long time with Canadian children, and, I know how to behave. I behave differently, and so I'm kind of an invisible immigrant. And you won't believe the insults, the offensive comments about Americans that I've had to put up with the whole time. I mean, if I was any other ethnic group, I would have gone to Human Rights Commission. But of course, that's silly. But it really, there's an undercurrent there, and it's kind of a smugness. And you see that in Britain, you see that in Canada, and I think that's very unfortunate. I think it's very destructive. And so one of the reasons I did this book, which you will appreciate, is I wanted to attack the Canadian establishment and say, wake up, there is one underway, let's manage it to our benefit, and attack American ignorance about Canada. And there's a couple of polls in the book about American understanding of Canada and polling about a merger. And it's real interesting. The closer the American is to the border, obviously, the more they know about Canada, the more they're fine. Let's get rid of the border. The security perimeter polling is 75% in Canada in favor of getting rid of the border. 75%. So, these are the things that our grassroots are down there, but it's really, really hard to break through at the top. And the media in Canada, in English Canada, the CBC, the Globe and Mail, are very, very, they always have that tinge of anti-Americanism, and that's not helpful.
I'm Peter Bogert from the German Institute of Global and Area Studies. First, a footnote. We are known from Hamburg to be more British than the British, so the Germanness of America and the Britishness of Canada shouldn't be a problem. But I think one issue which was just mentioned, and that is you are sitting beside the biggest nation of the world with all the responsibility and all the unpopularity. So you ask yourself, well, yes, let's integrate economically, that's fine, but there's no reason to share all these tremendous burdens which nobody likes. And so this burden obviously is for Canadians, if I would be one, which I would think twice and say, let's do all the economic things as an economist anyway, but politically, let's stay as, and yes, support what America does, what we believe to, but keep our independence. And we have one example, even in the economic scene, the financial crisis. Canada was the one who totally was able to avoid it. Right there, looking at the US going into a big mess. So you wonder.
Well, as I say, the German-style union only happened because of a crisis in Germany, and it'll only happen here. There was a really great quote that I used. The first quote in my book is from a historian, a Canadian historian named Jack Granatstein. And I think he nailed it. He said, Canadians are Americans who don't want to be U.S. citizens.
Kent, you wanted?
I just had a couple other questions for Diane, and coming from the perspective of assuming the merger has taken place. Are Canadians aware of how different the identity of individual states are in the United States? You alluded to Texas, but with regard to Mexico, there's been a big debate about building a wall along the Mexican border. Oregonians have long favored a wall right along that California border. So that there is a strong state identity, and Oregonians are quite different than Alabamans, who are different in turn than New Yorkers. The second question, again, assuming this merger has taken place, and there's an example of a kind of growing Anglo sphere, at least in terms of language, I sense that you also had some neo-Churchillian tendencies, thinking that, what about Australia and New Zealand? Wouldn't they like to join? And if the United Kingdom should decide to leave the European community, it made me think back to 1976, the United States was celebrating 200th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, and The Economist magazine, the one international magazine that likes the United States, had a picture of the Continental Congress, and then in that colonial script, be it hereby resolved that the United Kingdom shall be the 51st of these United States. So could you see that? We're now U.S., Canada, we have a new brand, as you suggested, and we're now looking out, and why not have the United Kingdom join?
Well, yeah, exactly. Why not? Why not do anything? And I think that those are politically driven issues. And, you know, you've got let's face it, most of the world's boundaries were imposed by colonial powers that bear no resemblance to the ethnicities, religious cohesiveness of the people involved. If you look at the Middle East, that is being rationalized right now. Syria was 3 kingdoms. Jordan has 3 tribes. None of it makes sense. And the subcontinent, South Asian, the French, English situation in Canada, and on and on and on it goes. So as those things get reevaluated and rationalized, yeah. I find the Scottish secession movement very intriguing, and that is going to, by the way, they're using the Quebec playbook. They meet. They're using the Quebec playbook, meaning, oh, we won't get rid of the monarchy or the Constitution, and we will keep the British pound, in this case the Canadian dollar, but we want to be independent. And of course, the British are being a little tougher minded than the Canadians were in the lead up to the '95 referendum in Canada. But, you know, I think that these pressures are going to be constant because none of the boundaries really make sense.
Well, that's just time. I'd like to thank the audience for good questions, and Kevin and Michael and Chris and Kent for their really neat observations, but most of all, Diane, for coming to talk with us, sharing these ideas, and really getting us thinking today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.